Hello and welcome everyone to this fifth webinar of our series on youth employment and politics, which is part of the IDS Strategic Research Initiative that's focused on youth. Thanks very much for joining us today. My name is Marioke Oosterom. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and I'll be chairing this panel discussion. I'm pleased that today's discussion is co-hosted with Include Knowledge Platform. Include promotes evidence-based policy making on inclusive development, and just like IDS, Include has a very strong focus on youth employment, and we collaborate on various occasions. And the topic of the webinar today is the livelihoods of young people in rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And this is linked to a previous webinar on youth employment that we had in March. Now, rural livelihoods are an important part of the wider debate on youth employment, as it is expected that around 60% of the youth population will be in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa for at least another decade, and agriculture is very important for economic transformation. But the discussion today will very clearly show that young people are doing very diverse economic activities, and not just farming, and they also want to be doing very different things. So we'll talk about aspirations and aspired futures as well. And this includes things about education, mobility, and participation. So we're very pleased to be launching a book today, The Youth and the Rural Economy in Africa, Hard Work and Hazard, edited by Jim Semberg and published by CABI, and several policy briefings. We will also launch an evidence review on rural employment, published by Include, and everyone will receive the links to these outputs by email. We have organized the webinar as a panel discussion, and I will now introduce you to the speakers. So first of all, Jim Semberg, he's the editor of the book, Hard Work and Hazard, and he's Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies with expertise in smallholder agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa and long-standing expertise on youth engagement in rural economies. And we have Dr. Thomas Yeboah and Justin Flynn, who are the authors of the evidence review. And as it happens, they've also contributed to the book. Justin Flynn is my colleague at IDS, whose research focuses mainly on the role of agricultural sector in rural development and livelihood opportunities for young people. And Thomas Yeboah is a research fellow at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. He has a PhD in development studies from the University of Cambridge and has expertise in migration and development and youth livelihoods and mobilities. Also joining us today is Dr. Barbara Crossoir from the Center of International Education at Sussex. And we have our discussants, Professor Ben White from the Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University in the Netherlands, and Nicole Sloot, who works for the NGO AgriTerra, leads the youth participation program there, and has worked on this for several years. So our discussants will draw connections to the wider academic and policy debates. After a conversation with these panelists, they will be answering your questions. You can write your questions in the chat or in the Q&A window. And following this webinar, you will receive a link to the recorded presentation and all the links of all the outputs. So it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Jim Semberg, who will be presenting the main findings from the book. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Marioke. Today, it's a real pleasure to introduce our new book, Youth in the Rural Economy in Africa, Hard Work and Hazard. I say our new book because it was very much a collaborative effort involving researchers from the University of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, Makerere University and Gulu University in Uganda, the National Root Crops Research Institute in Nigeria, Université Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, the International Center for Maize and Wheat Improvement, the University of Sussex here in the UK, my colleagues at the Institute of Development Studies, and of course the hundreds and hundreds of young people who participated in the research across the various sites. Some of the researchers involved in the fieldwork, as you've just heard, and as chapter authors are with us today, including Thomas Yeboah and Justin Flynn, who you will hear from a little bit later on. I hope you will also have an opportunity to hear from some of the others as we move through the program. The research underpinning this book was funded over a 4-year period by IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. The book is also informed by a number of research projects funded by the MasterCard Foundation and by APRA, the Agricultural Policy Research for Africa program, which operates with UK government support. Well, the good news is the book is available open access, and Rachel will be posting the download link in the chat. Today, we are also launching 4 policy briefs and a short summary report, all linked to the book. And again, the download information for these, as well as directions to see a short film made in Nigeria, will be available in the chat. I very much hope that you will take some time to look at these materials and to do some reading, and also to circulate the links widely amongst your colleagues and networks. And just in case you have any doubt, I wanted to show you that the book actually exists in hard copy. It's not just an elusive PDF file. If you want one, you could buy a copy as well. Well, that's enough of the plug. The background, or the backdrop for the research was a significant policy and the significant policy and academic influence of a prominent, persistent, and powerful narrative about young people in rural Africa. You're probably all well aware of this narrative, elements of which suggest that the current generations of young people are part of an unprecedented and potentially dangerous youth bulge. But they could help deliver a hugely important demographic dividend to the economy. They are, after all, innovative and very quick to adopt new technology. But they have no interest in farming. Indeed, they can't wait to leave rural areas and are migrating to urban areas in large numbers. And even if they want to farm, they can't get access to land. In effect, they're stuck in permanent waithood because they can't enter the labor market. And they are prone to falling into criminal and violent behavior because of limited job prospects and are susceptible to radicalization. This narrative informs and drives much youth-oriented policy and programming. Well, we wanted to take a step back and to ask, how do young people actually engage with the rural economy? How do young people actually engage with the rural economy? Of course, the question was never really that simple. Because we were interested in taking account of the diversity of young people in terms of age and gender and other social characteristics, education levels, and so on, and the diversity of rural areas in terms of population density, economic dynamism, and agricultural potential. And the important follow-on question was, what are the implications for how young people engage with the rural economy for policy and programming? So what did we learn? Well, if you stop focusing on what we can think of as the aren'ts, young people aren't staying in rural areas. Young people aren't interested in farming. Young people aren't able to access land. Young people aren't able to attain the social markers of adulthood. And instead, we focus on the millions and millions of young people who are living and working in rural areas. What we see, I think, is a fairly generalized story of livelihood building under severe and persistent constraints. Having been buffeted as children by forces beyond their control, including widespread poverty, parental illness or death, family breakup, or civil unrest, young women and men are then let down by formal education. Quality is low, and many are forced to leave school early because it is simply not affordable. The deeply gendered rural opportunity landscapes they encounter offer few prospects for remunerative, secure, or decent work, to say nothing of salaried employment. But through their own hard work and with the support of their families and social networks, they set about to build their livelihoods in contexts where infrastructure is generally poor and services lacking, and gendered social norms and strong social hierarchies restrict room for maneuver, particularly for young women. These livelihoods reflect shifting patterns of engagement with the rural economy, combining unpaid caring and domestic work with farming, non-farm wage employment, and non-farm self-employment. The informal and seasonal nature of much of this economic activity gives rise to endemic precarity, where work is characterized by risk, limited financial reward, instability, and lack of any kind of protection. But livelihood building extends well beyond the labor market, with young people navigating the challenges of securing accommodation, furthering their own education, caring for parents and siblings, and negotiating relationships, marriage, children, and citizenship. The futures that young people imagine for themselves usually involve expansion of their current activities, often combined with diversification into others. Interestingly, large-scale modern agriculture features in many of these imagined futures, but often young people imagine themselves farming and running their businesses as managers of hired labor. They do not see themselves working in the fields. Many also imagine restarting or furthering their education. Mobility and migration also figure in many imagined futures. In some contexts, the focus is on nearby rural towns, with the idea of maintaining a firm base in the rural economy, while in others, a more classic flight to larger urban centers is imagined. In other words, for the vast majority of young people in the study sites, their engagement with the rural economy in the early stages of livelihood building is best characterized as hard work in the face of hazard, personal hazard, financial hazard, and environmental hazard. It is important to note that while the opportunity landscape is limited in most places, it is not equally limited everywhere. But as yet, we do not have a sufficiently clear or nuanced understanding of these spatial differences. In other words, there is still much to learn about how economic geography facilitates or constrains the economic activities of rural youth. The picture that emerges from our research is significantly different from that portrayed by the dominant narrative about rural youth. We are not saying that the narrative is wrong or that some elements of this narrative do not have some validity, nor are we saying that all young people aspire to stay in rural areas and to farm, or that any young person who wants to farm can easily access all the land they desire. But rather, a key conclusion is that from the research is that this narrative, built around the persistent and powerful aren'ts highlighted earlier, simply does not do justice to the hard work, agency, diversity, and richness of experience of young rural women and men in the early stages of livelihood building. And in this sense, we believe the narrative provides a very poor basis for policy and programming. I want to finish by noting that, as I think is probably usual in the course of a research program like this, all did not go according to plan. Our team had very high hopes of designing and implementing a program of truly mixed methods research. Well, I think we got some way down this path. For a variety of reasons, we fell short in really bringing together quantitative and qualitative methods, analyses, and insights. This remains a critically important and frankly very difficult challenge for those seeking to understand the lives and livelihoods of young rural women and men in Africa and the futures they imagine for themselves. And it certainly deserves our full and continued attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation of the book, and the message comes out loud and clear about many young people wanting to farm, but under different conditions than they presently find themselves. I'd like to hand over to Professor Ben White. You've read the book. We're looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marioka, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I could actually talk for a very long time about what I found interesting in the book, but I promised Marioka I'll take only 5 minutes, so I'm going to be very, very selective. But first, I have to give a word of congratulations to Jim and all the team from all the different institutions involved in this research and production of the book. I've also been quite often involved in multi-institutional, multi-sited collaborative research projects, and I find it really an achievement that you've managed with all your different backgrounds and interests to produce such a coherent end result. And I hope whatever may have happened along the way that we don't need to know about, that you've all remained good friends. I wish that there could be similar collections for other world regions of critical studies like this on young people and the rural economy. The dominant narratives about rural youth, which Jim has just summarized, and which are explained in greater detail in chapter 1 of the book, they're equally prevalent in many Asian countries. In Indonesia, for example, where I've done some work on rural youth, there's the same widespread assumption that young rural men and women are turning their backs on farming and the rural world, based on faulty statistics about youth employment and a few surveys of young people's aspirations. And based on this kind of information, just recently, a high-level official in the National Planning Agency predicted with great confidence that there will be no one at all left working in agriculture by the year 2063. So this brings me to my first point of appreciation, which is for the way in which the study has been framed, taking a critical but an open-minded look at the 7 dominant policy narratives, and in the empirical work, putting young people and their activities at center stage, exploring their lives, their livelihoods, their relationships, and their imagined futures in a life course and a generational perspective. And this approach has resulted in a lot of interesting and important findings and reflections in each of the 8 thematic chapters, but I have time only to comment on a couple of these. Firstly, in chapter 2 correctly underlines the need for a stronger empirical base than the kinds of data on which these dominant narratives about rural youth are based. For example, claims that young people are abandoning agriculture, they're based on 2 main sources of information. First, conventional statistics on population, labor force, and employment, and second, surveys of young people's aspirations, in which there are some version of the question, what would you like to be when you grow up? And not surprisingly, answering this question to a stranger, and probably in front of their teachers, their parents, or their peers, or all 3, they say they don't want to be farmers. Conventional population and employment statistics give an inaccurate picture of young people's work, just as crude surveys of aspirations are an inaccurate indicator of actual or likely futures. In labor force surveys, an individual cannot be both in school or college and also in the labor force, while, as this book shows clearly, large numbers of people do combine school or college with part-time work. Also, in those who are in the labor force, they're asked to report on only one main job, while the book shows that large numbers of people combine work in the farm and the off-farm sectors. And furthermore, as the work on their imagined futures clearly shows, those who are considering futures in farming expect and hope, quite wisely in my view, that they will combine this with other non-farm income sources. Young rural livelihoods, as the book shows, tend to be pluri-active. They're also often pluri-local, but in conventional population statistics, you're either an urban or a rural resident with no consideration of the millions who regularly move between rural and urban areas. So the book provides a powerful ammunition for a wake-up call to UN agencies, national governments, and others to support more accurate ways of capturing young people's employment patterns. But perhaps we should not hold our breath waiting for this to happen, since the same methods have been used basically for the last 80 years. Another thing I'd like to mention is the contribution this book makes to the growing evidence that for today's young men and women in rural areas, human capital theory just doesn't work. That's the theory that says that more education ensures better jobs and higher incomes. Of course, it's true that you can't get formal sector or professional jobs without the necessary diplomas, or one hopes so anyway, if you go to visit the doctor or the dentist. But it's equally true that having the diplomas is no guarantee at all of getting the jobs, as the book explains. Most people in today's crowded and often shrinking formal sector labor market, most people simply take whatever jobs or work is available. The employment and livelihood problems of today's young rural people, who are on average better endowed with human capital than earlier generations, cannot be explained away as individual failures or educational failures. They are structural problems needing structural solutions. And this book is completely correct in concluding in its last chapter that policies then need to focus on opportunity structures and structural conditions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm sure everyone who contributed to the book appreciated how you've engaged with it. Jim, I wanted to give you a quick opportunity to respond before we move on to the presentation of the Include paper.
Well, at this point, I think I'd just like to say thank you very much, Ben. That was really nice. Yeah. Let me stop there, Marioka, and let's carry on with the questions and the discussion as we go.
That's all right, certainly. And we're moving on to Justin and Thomas, who will present their a couple of findings from their paper on the evidence review on rural employment. So they've spoken a lot about interventions too in Justin.
Yes, hi, I'm just going to share my
There you are.
screen.
Yeah, you want to share your screen.
Yes, hopefully this works.
And one of the things that overlaps between this book, the book and the paper is what you've talked about in terms of youth aspirations and what you've learned about youth aspirations with regards to farming. And yeah, I'm assuming some of your presentation will speak to this as well.
Yes, well, I'll focus on one aspect of our report, which is on, in our view, the importance of growth in agricultural productivity in Africa for rural youth employment. And I believe my colleague Thomas and fellow co-author of the report is going to speak more to the Imagine Futures aspect. But I guess since we're here, I'll start on my end. So yeah, hi everybody, and it's really great that you're all joining us, and thanks Marioka for chairing this. So as I was saying, I'll be presenting mainly one part of our report, which is basically the third section. There should be a link, I believe, to the report in the chat, but in any case, this is what it looks like. So again, Thomas, my colleague, was the first author and the second author. So just before we dive into in our view, the importance of agricultural productivity growth, just a quick reminder. I think we're all probably pretty familiar with these numbers, and as Ben rightly pointed out, these numbers should very likely be taken with a pretty big grain of salt, because they are inexact. Even in our report, we talk about the definition of rural areas and how really there is no one definition of rural areas, and the boundaries are really not that clear cut. So again, with a grain of salt, but at least in terms of general aggregation of statistics by the UN and others, this is an indication of maybe what the world looks like in Africa. And I think in that sense, it could be a useful starting point. So again, you're probably very familiar, but 60% of the population is under 25 years of age. So very large youth population. That's according to the World Population Prospects 2019. According to Bruno Loesch, 60% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa will continue to live lives mainly based in rural areas. But of course, there's a lot of movement between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas, also rural to rural. And in North Africa, actually, the proportion of the population that is rural is higher than I think many of us would imagine. So for all the countries in North Africa, it's about 44%. Again, this is an estimate, and it goes from maybe what I sort of imagined before doing the report, Algeria, which is seems to be less rural, with about 27% of the population, up to Egypt, which is predominantly, it appears, rural, with over 50% of the population being based in rural areas, and Sudan, which is the most, let's say, rural-based in North Africa. So why did we focus on agriculture and the importance of agricultural productivity growth? Well, we wanted to make the point that according to the literature, but according to us as well, agriculture can be seen as an engine of economic growth. Reardon et al. Said this in 2007, that agriculture is one of the 3 potential rural engines of growth. The other 2 they mention is mining and tourism, but these are not available or possible everywhere, and agriculture is more widespread, at least we would argue. And McCullough, for example, said that in a study of 4 sub-Saharan African countries on productivity, she said that apart from agriculture, no other engine of rural economic growth is apparent. And also, in terms of agricultural productivity growth, it's claimed as important as this is an important aspect of our story, or of our argument, is that it's important for rural transformation. And this is according to the 2016 IFAD Rural Development Report. Rural transformation can be sort of induced through agricultural productivity growth or increases, which leads to marketable surpluses, which leads to livelihood diversification, and more opportunities generally in the economy. And in the World Economic and Social Outlook of it's 2015 actually, but it was published in 2016. There's a chapter on decent work. So here are some links to decent employment and agricultural productivity growth. And there is a chapter there that focuses on rural areas and how we can basically promote decent work. And they identify 4 pathways. And one of them is through basically small scale independent production, contract farming arrangements, which we talk more about in our paper, and you can read about that. The establishment of non-farm economic activities, and agricultural waged employment. So how do increases in agricultural productivity actually lead to decent employment? So in the ILO's report itself, which focuses on decent employment, they really basically say that the link to decent work is not that easy. It's actually, the benefits can basically be derived in the source of income increases and poverty reduction. And those are sort of the first steps towards decent employment. But the link really from largely informal small-scale agriculture in many parts of rural Africa to decent employment is the jump, is not made right away. And they themselves sort of recognize that. Where there is maybe more scope for fostering decent work is where there's large scale agricultural waged employment, where there's arguments that laborers can be organized together and form unions and really fight for what are really the decent work pillars. And I'll skip over this, but yeah, so yeah, there are pathways to improved employment outcomes, but to decent work, it's probably a longer term affair. But it's not something that we should shun either, of course. Anyway, there's broad consensus that agricultural productivity growth is important. Even more skeptical economists, such as Golan at Oxford, would say that basically, given the importance of agriculture in essentially all countries in Africa, it's hard to imagine significant growth or poverty reduction without or in the absence of agricultural productivity growth. So, and finally, I think the same month that our Include report was published, another report was published by Thomas Jane, Louise Fox, and others, talking about basically the importance of agricultural productivity growth. And their conclusions are essentially that they say, given the extensive employment linkages between agriculture and the rest of the economy, efforts to promote agricultural productivity growth will expand job opportunities for youth both on and especially off the farm, which is something we contend in our report. And they conclude by saying that while we should invest to increase productivity on farm and off the farm, and I do want to stress this, it's not the only policy that we would advocate to try to improve rural young people's lives and livelihoods. It's just one that we feel that is important and has probably been overlooked. As you could see from government's investment in agriculture in Africa still remains quite low. Some countries such as agriculture such as Ethiopia and others have increased it, but by and large, it seems to have been ignored by governments. And I think there's a lot of improvements that can be there. So they say to invest in productivity on farms, but also to invest in industries where that are labor intensive and where there is wage employment. And that could be in agricultural processing, that could be in industrial manufacturing, for example, and to try to increase the number of jobs in those sectors as well. So it's basically a two-pronged approach: agriculture on farms and agriculture where there's and investment where there's wage employment already. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Justin. That's great. It really resonates with the earlier discussion in the previous webinar on focusing on structural conditions, something Ben also highlighted and Jim from the book. We're going over to Thomas, because apart from the structural opportunities available, there's also the question of what young people want. Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Ed.
Thank you very much, Majoka, and good afternoon to everyone. So on the issue of young people's aspirations regarding farming and life in rural areas, I mean, both the reports that we wrote for Include and our own, the book, the chapter in the book suggests that the story is very much more nuanced and complex. So on the one hand, you have issues of lack of access to productive resources like land, gender norms, and the fact that agriculture and rural life is a problem, issues with education and young people's own rising expectations, lack of services. All these are factors that influence young people's aspirations.
There we go. I think Thomas just dropped from the Zoom. We have the connection challenges when we're working with Ghana. Justin, would you be able to speak a bit, or is Thomas back?
Hi, Majoka.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, Thomas, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Thomas.
Hello? Yes, so what I was saying is that with regards to young people's own aspirations, particularly with regards to agriculture and rural life, what we find is that the evidence is much more complex than what preaches. So on the one hand, you have issues with lack of access to productive resources, gender norms, and young people's own rising expectations influencing their aspirations not to engage with the rural economy and farm work or agriculture. But on the other hand too, we find that for many millions of young people, depending on the context, and especially those who are already engaged in the agricultural sector, many aspire to a future in which the agricultural sector and the rural economy will still have a major role to play in their lives. And within these imaginaries, like James mentioned earlier, many envisage using hired or supervised labor, expanding their livelihoods portfolios, particularly in the agricultural sector. And many envisage that they will be engaging in the farming or agricultural sector, hopefully under much more better conditions. So having access to technology, having access to services that can really improve the work that they do in the rural areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you for staying with us despite any connection challenges. I'd like to ask Nicole Sloat from Agriterra to make her contribution. Nicole, you work for an NGO which is active in implementing rural livelihood programs generally, but you work specifically on youth participation in these programs. So, and you've read the report. So how is this useful to you as an organization?
Yes, correct. Thank you, Marjoke. And well, good afternoon to everyone, first of all, and congratulations, Jim, on the publication of the book and also the publication of this report, which I thought was very well written and clearly written. So thank you for that. Yes, well, as youth program coordinator of Agriterra, I've read the publication with much interest. And from a practical point of view, which I'm going to give here in this webinar, I would like to point out that we can take lessons from your findings on interventions and on how to combine interventions for more effective implementation to enhance youth engagement in agribusiness. And as we work primarily with cooperatives, which have proven to be excellent vehicles for increasing agricultural productivity and where decent employment can be created in the long run, I just wanted to stress how much we should emphasize underemployment over unemployment. So decent jobs can and will really make a difference. And in the publication, it also is indicated that members of farmer groups have access to resources that positively impact their decision to adopt new technologies, which I think is very positive news for us as Agriterra, working with these farmer groups, cooperatives, farmers organizations. And something we should keep in mind when we talk about climate smart farming and ICT and the role that cooperatives can play in that sense. And also taking into account, as you mentioned in your recommendations, the contextual factors and the constraints. Then another thing I wanted to mention is that on farm level, two things really struck me when it came to the aspirations mentioned in chapter 5. Students' aspirations were rooted in their social standing in society, it says, and more educated youth aspired more highly skilled jobs and less well-educated young men aspired lower skilled jobs, including farming. And yeah, well, who says farming is a lower skilled job? That was my first question. I think that's all about perception. And the other point was the land inheritance point that came up in the paper. Youth who aspire to farming future expected to inherit land from a family member, which makes sense why they aspire farming, and makes me want to bring up a point that I think we also shouldn't overlook, which is farm succession. I've met a dairy farmer in Kenya who showed me a piece of land that once belonged to his parents and was now divided between him and his 5 brothers. And he's the only one who wants to venture into farming and wants to scale up, while his brothers have a job elsewhere, which is fine. And yet they want to keep the land because they don't want to sell it, and it remains idle because of that. So the issue of farm succession and land inheritance I didn't read it in this publication specifically, but I think that is something I would like to mention, that it should make it more difficult for youth to venture into farming. And it can be a stepping stone for to scale up productivity in agriculture, and thus income and livelihoods. So that is my take on this publication, with the perspective of my job as a youth program coordinator at Agiterra, and a farmer's daughter myself. So it makes it even more interesting to read it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for that. It's really nice to have this perspective from a practitioner and personal experience on this report. Justin, would you like to briefly respond to this discussion, to Nicole's points, and then we'll move on to some other questions?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nicole. Those are really nice comments and interesting ones. We're glad that you find the same in terms of especially your work with cooperatives or farmers groups. We definitely found them to be important in, like we said, accessing resources and improving productivity and so on, and investment on farm and so on. In terms of land inheritance, I think our point was that those who see futures in farming, they would see them partly because they assume or they expect to inherit land. But of course, that is not always the case. Their expectations are not always matched in reality. As you mentioned, I mean, if it ends up being divided among more of your brothers, or rarely maybe your sisters, or your aunt, etc., then it might be more difficult to navigate that future to meet your expectation. But I think that's the main. But if you have reason to suspect that you will inherit it, then you can more easily take that into account into your future. Where there is a lot of inheritance, I think there are issues as to how are you going to make farming part of your livelihood or your whole livelihood, and then probably we need to look at policies into seeing how young people can access land. I mean, we know, including from the book, that young people, even if they don't have land, or young women sometimes are able to, on their own, sometimes with their spouses, but sometimes on their own, they're able to borrow land, rent land, and pay money for that. So that's hopefully one possibility. And those land markets are pretty dynamic depending where you are. So there are opportunities, but it is certainly a challenge for young people if they don't have access to as much land as they expected. I don't know if Thomas wanted to, if I'm missing anything, Thomas, but yeah.
Thomas, any quick thoughts? No, okay. I'll move on to Jim, because there was one important connection between the report and the book, and that was on the issue of productivity. Productivity as a potential for creating more jobs, eventually, hopefully, creating also decent jobs. What are your thoughts based on the research for the book and also other research you've done?
Right. Thanks, Marioka. I'll just make a really brief comment on productivity. I was hoping that our colleague Jordan was going to be able to come in, but I'm not sure whether he's with us or not. So I'm fully agreed that agricultural productivity enhancement in sub-Saharan Africa is really important. And it will be really important for everybody in rural areas, not just young people. That's the first thing that we have to say. And I think I'm really happy that Justin and Thomas in their report have sketched this out in a broad way. So there's likely that much of the impact of enhanced agricultural productivity will be indirect, probably through processing jobs and agro-industry kinds of jobs, as opposed to direct effects through young people as farmers. And I think it's just really important to make the point that when we think about that, because that I think is the trap, to think that investing in agricultural research that increases maize or cassava productivity is going to create jobs for young people. But what our book tells us is that, well, a lot of young people have their hand in farming, or have one hand in farming, they're also doing all kinds of other things. Many of them are. So even if you have a technology, a cassava technology or a new maize variety that has the potential to increase maize yields, it may only be a quarter or 20% or 10% of their livelihood. So it's unlikely to make any kind of discernible impact. And I think, so while the what do we want to call them, diversified livelihoods, which are now, I think, characteristic of young people and many older people in sub-Saharan Africa, they can be seen as very positive and related to resilience and so on. On the other hand, they also make it much more difficult to make change happen through the direct route of agricultural research, increased productivity, increased income. That's what I'll say there. Was I going to say a little bit on aspirations as well, Marioka?
You can, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to just make a comment about this, and that is that I'm not sure all my colleagues would agree with this, but what's really struck me about all the work we did on aspirations was, in a way, how immediate they were, how they're about today and tomorrow. They're really immediate. So their aspirations, like, I want to go from having 1 pig to having 3 pigs, or I want to go from having maize and cassava to having maize, cassava, and bananas. I'm characterizing a little bit too much, but they were really operational kind of aspirations, immediate things and many of them were doing some expansion of current activities or maybe diversification into an additional activity. I'm not critiquing that at all, but what I do think that, in a way, they're very different when we see aspirations and people expressing how they imagine their future in that sense. Whereas in the literature, and when we talk about it, I think we often cast youth aspirations in almost a magical way, as if we can get some great insight if we could only learn to tap into youth aspirations. And I think, at least one of the things I took from the research, is that many of the folks, the young people that we talk to, are so busy working day to day and struggling and trying to get on and make a living and so on. They are thinking, 1 step or 2 steps ahead. And that is about, how do I go from a little tiny pig producing operation to a slightly less tiny pig producing operation? And you can get one kind of insight in that, but it's not at that level. The kind of discussion and focus on aspirations isn't quite what I think it's taught as it's portrayed in much of the literature, where we're going to really learn something important about young people's long-term vision for the future, their country, and so on and so forth. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Jim. There are questions in the meantime are coming in, including about productivity, which we want to address through the Q&A session. We first want to cover a different aspect of the rural young people questions, and that's around education and skills, because that's also an important area of intervention for both governments and NGOs alike. So Justin, you did a lot of work on skill training, key for youth living in rural areas. What are the implications of your report when we talk about skills training? Where should investments be made?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion at IDS around skills training, and I won't go too much into those discussions. But essentially, our report did find that skills training interventions can help young people, can improve employment outcomes for young people. But I think we need to be careful of what types of employment outcomes or improvements we're hoping to see. If it's leading to decent employment, again, sort of overnight, I think that's probably overambitious. Again, probably the best way to do that is, again, we would argue either agricultural productivity growth to kind of really generate large scale improvement of livelihoods, or at least poverty reduction, and also investing where there are seemingly decent jobs to attract investment into those jobs so that they can employ more people. But in terms of skills, we saw that especially interventions that combine several that had a design that didn't only do one intervention. So for example, where we saw skills training and internships, so classroom training and being matched with a specific employer, that could increase kind of employment outcomes for young people. Or if the interventions were designed largely by the private sector, those tended to have there was a 20 to 30% more higher likelihood that those interventions would have a positive effect. And we saw that especially that interventions also had more effect in more disadvantaged background in lower income countries or with youth from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So if they're matched, even mixed with entrepreneurship promotion, we saw an improvement in employment outcomes. But again, what does that really mean? It means that because providing skills is not going to necessarily create jobs, but it could potentially improve the ones that, small informal businesses the young people are in, for example, in the rural non-farm economy. It might improve those outcomes a little bit, but it's not necessarily creating new jobs, and there's not much evidence to say it creates decent employment, but it can potentially get them further ahead in the non-farm economy, for example, potentially alongside farming other activities they may have.
Okay, thanks. That resonates with some of the other bigger reports on skills building programs and impact. We're going to dive a bit deeper into the education question. Barbara Closoir of Center of International Education. You were part of the fieldwork team as well in Nigeria. And could you speak a bit to your findings on gender, especially gender and educational needs, as education is such a gendered issue?
Yep, thank you very much. And of course, work is also highly gendered. In fact, as Jim said in his opening presentation, the whole rural landscape is gendered. Now, I appreciated Ben's comments when he commented in the book for highlighting that one of the narratives that the book has disrupted is that youth move from education to work as if this was a linear pathway. That's the dominant narrative that human capital theory supposes. And of course, the youth that we engaged with are doing both. They're combining in a highly precarious way, moving in and out of school with work of many different kinds, whether it's farming, non-farming, or work in the home. And this, for young women, has a particular dimension because they have high expectations of domestic work. They're engaged in unpaid farming work and paid farming work, but it's the level, I think, of unpaid domestic work and then reproductive work that is really impacting on young girls' education. Whereas young men are able to go out and contribute often to the cost of their schooling through the income they can earn, the opportunities for young women to do that are more restricted, more limited. And that means they are forced out of school early and very often make the transition from their parental home to a marital home, end up themselves in doing reproductive labor in that sense. So yeah, a very gendered picture that impacts very severely on young women in particular.
Thank you. And what would your recommendations been then for education interventions in rural areas?
So there is a very striking issue that, in relation to the SDGs, this call for education to be affordable. For rural youth, it's not. It's a shocking policy failure. I think we said that in the book. I just want to repeat that. And that impacts in a very gendered way on young women. So in the chapter in my book, I think I've called this effectively the rural economy as a sexual economy, because it's depending on the unpaid labor effectively and reproductive labor of young women. So major gender inequalities here. In terms of interventions, I here talk about skills interventions, as if this sounds as if it's something that's added on, an add-on outside formal education. There's a major issue, I think, of looking more closely at the curriculum within formal schooling and making that more relevant for rural youth, making it less academic, so you don't have these imaginaries of professional work, which are largely not available to rural youth. But one of the powerful imaginaries, yes, is of this white-collar job. There are many ways of making a living. Where is this imaginary coming from? I think it is probably coming partly from schooling itself. And also to look in the curriculum at the way gender is represented, what kinds of work are represented as doable, ideal for young women and young men. So I would pay more attention to the structures of formal schooling in terms of improvements in for education in rural contexts. Thank you.
Thanks much, Barbara. And in the book, we have a whole chapter co-authored by you and others on education. So do take a look, everyone. Thomas, I would like to come back to you to one other important feature of rural people's lives, and that's mobility. We found in the book it's really part and parcel of people's lives, on the move all the time, whether it's for education or for livelihoods. But in like the dominant narrative in policy discourse is migration or mobility as something rather negative, something that it's a problem that should be stopped. But is it really? What did you find?
Thank you very much again, Majoka. I think on this subject, the issue of the fact that young people's mobility is a problem within the mainstream literature highlight three main key issues to kind of propose policy to limit the mobility of young people. And one has to do with the fact that it's a threat to the agricultural sector and food security. And then also young people's mobility put pressure on urban areas infrastructure, and the fact that it's also a riskier venture for young people. But we find that in majority of cases, the mobility trajectories of young people is mostly temporal, right? And historically, many young people have utilized mobility to build their livelihoods, and it's been a part and parcel of the way of life of many people, including young people. It's been a means for many young people to access educational opportunities, which may not be very direct within their local communities. It's also a very good a means for young people to access economic opportunities and improve their own life chances, seek more autonomy, and negotiate new forms of interdependence and independence. And for most young people too, their mobility allows them to accumulate resources that they invest back in the rural areas that they live. So it's to be quite dangerous that we initiate policies or policy seeks to limit or stop the mobility of young people, because in the attempt of trying to do that, it is very likely that given all the benefits that are associated with mobility that I've spoken about, if there are any attempts to limit this, then it's very likely that it might rather make some young people in rural Africa more worse off. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks very much. We're moving to the final section of our panel discussion, and then we start answering the questions from the audience. And this final section is about the post-COVID realities, and linking to this debate that has emerged about building back better. And we want to discuss rural livelihoods and young people within that debate. Starting with you, Justin, you reviewed a number of policy interventions. So which would you highlight as good approaches to continue? And perhaps in relation to productivity, but maybe others.
Yes, yes, I might focus on agricultural productivity. I think it came up as hopefully you can see the little graph on my screen.
Yeah.
Great. So I think it came up as one of the questions, but it is something that we addressed, sort of partially or a little bit superficially in our report. Admittedly, we sort of pointed you towards resources that sort of elaborate on how to increase agricultural productivity. But in that report that came out basically at the same time, which we didn't know about, by Thomas Jane, Louise Fox, and others, they have a nice little graph that I think sums it up. And as Jim rightly pointed out, agricultural production itself is certainly not the only way to hopefully improve livelihoods and improve economic opportunities for, and not only young people, but for all people in rural areas. We would certainly agree, whether it's through processing and retail and other activities. But in terms of agriculture itself, there are various interventions, we think. So this is basically a graph that shows that you can increase in productivity through basically extending the amount of land that you cultivate, and that's sort of not, we probably wouldn't want to focus on that, because actually you're not really increasing real productivity, or what's called total factor productivity. But you're just, and land is running out, as we talked about with Nicole as well. There isn't, and I think it was one of the questions as well, or a comment, there isn't an infinite number of land, including in Africa. So what are some other ways to increase productivity? Well, there's input intensification. And for example, in Africa, there's in 2018, or in sub-Saharan Africa, farmers used on average about 18 kilograms per hectare of plant nutrients. So, basically fertilizers, whereas that amount is 7 times higher in Asia and in Latin America. So they point in input intensification as one way to do it. And this can be through extension policies and services. Another way to do it, which has recently come up in a FAO major report, I believe on food security, on water security, is just the expansion of irrigation. This led, for example, in Africa, about only 3% of land is irrigated, but in countries such as Morocco, where 13% of land is irrigated, so quite a bit more, irrigated agriculture contributes 45% of added value to the sector, and 75% of exports, and 35% of agricultural employment. So, and there is scope even for small scale irrigation schemes through farmer groups and so on. So I think that's another area where we can improve. Of course, I'll just finish by saying this. There's other ways. There's also potentially providing credit through extension or through NGOs and increasing tenure security. But I think, and again, I think this came up as one of the comments. But we have to figure out how to increase productivity, but sustainably. So of course we can't just go, applying inorganic, fertilizers, just any which way everywhere, and also, using local water resources. We have to do it in an intelligent way, and I think the way to do that, and we can go into this more in the question and answer, but it depends on context, how we do that and where. So, but I'll leave that there.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you. Back to Jim then. What are your thoughts about not going back to business as usual after the pandemic?
Well, Marioka, I think the answer is really, really simple. If we want to avoid and disrupt the business as usual story, what we need to do is we need to change the narrative, because that narrative that I talked about initially and that Ben and others have commented on, that underpins, it justifies, it enables business as usual. And as long as that narrative is driving policy, the whole idea of building back better is going to go nowhere for African agriculture or for rural youth. Now, changing that narrative is going to be a hard, difficult struggle, and it's going to depend on everybody getting involved. There are real interests, there's politics and interests around that narrative, but if that narrative doesn't change, if the aren'ts and the kind of the focus of that narrative, putting it on the faults of young people, if that doesn't change, there's going to be it will be business as usual, and there'll be no building back better. Thanks.
Thanks. Ben, would you like to add anything to that? Just unmute.
I'm trying, yeah. Okay, very briefly, if I may. I think it's very important to remember, and if I perhaps think just about food systems, that actually already prior to the COVID pandemic, people were already growing up in a world which was nowhere near on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals targets about food, where 1 in 3 people worldwide still are affected by malnutrition, and so on and so on. Global inequalities persisting and growing concern about youth unemployment, and so on and so on. Now, all these problems have been exacerbated and accelerated by the pandemic, but I think it's important to think that although short-term actions responding to the crisis are important, in the longer term, the crisis provides an opportunity and a momentum for more fundamental and permanent transformations. And at the level of intellectual and policy discourse, which is what we're doing today, visions of supplying the world's food needs in different, better, more agroecological ways have made significant progress. This relates also to ideas about less growth, different ways of growth, degrowth, and so on. But unfortunately, I think most governments and other institutions are still framing their thinking with traditional economic models of GDP growth, and slotting youth into these models without recognizing the damage this is doing to society and to the planet. So actually the pressing challenge is then to transform these visions and the discourse into action on a much broader scale. And of course, for young people to be able to and willing to position and reposition themselves on the front line in this transformation.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Nicole, that's something you've actually worked on, putting young people in the picture. What's your takeaway from this? What would you want to do building back better?
Well, as we already do, we will continue to support youth councils, setting up youth groups linked to cooperatives. These youth have proven to have great business ideas linked to the cooperative and their business case. So we will continue to support them and empowering these youth together with the board and the management of these cooperatives. We will also have to adjust and adapt our advisory services moving forward. And I think we also need to support the adoption of climate smart approaches and link them to the youth and the youth councils we have at the cooperatives. Focus on farmer education, also together with the farmer organizations and the cooperatives, and promoting decent work at these organizations so that we can move from informal participation to more formal participation in the rural economy gradually. So that is my take on that.
Thanks very much. And you said something about, you said empowering youth. That's actually the first time in this whole webinar that we hear the word empowerment, which is quite unusual for discussions and on young people. And in the book, we've also we've dedicated a chapter on waithood and participation, and there's what strikes me from the various discussion on youth employment and youth politics is that there's been so much knowledge on youth participation in the field of democratic governance, which seems not to be used yet. Both the concepts or the approaches to youth participation haven't been taken up yet very much in the field of youth employment and in rural youth livelihoods. So NGOs have definitely made a lot of progress in terms of integrating young people's voices and participation in all stages of the project cycle. So what you've just said, Nicole, actually speaks directly to that. But I think there's still quite a few disconnects. So moving forward in rebuilding back better, there's definitely another step to be made in not seeing young people just as producers, especially when it's about rural economies, but also citizens in their own right. And I think in particular in the wider ecosystem on youth employment, whether it's rural or not rural, there are still missing bits in terms of young people actually involved in the national level policy discussions. So they can participate when it's about the Ministry of Youth, but not the Ministry of Agriculture, not ministries of trade. So there's dialogues to be had there. There are the national unions and farmer associations, for example, but young people have a limited voice in those kind of institutions, where some of the youth empowerment work can really move into. At the local level, and this speaks to a question one of the people in the audience had about youth expectations of the state. We definitely saw young people having clear expectations in terms of services provision, both in terms of accessing loans like financial services, but also the more infrastructural development to enable them to do the livelihood they want, as well as more flexible educational services or more flexible organized training and skills because of the many different activities they do. So there were clear expectations of what they would like governments to do for them. At the same time, a big frustration with governments being very remotely present in their lives and they're not able to tell anyone, not even local governments, what it is they need or aspire. They equally often tend to have limited voice in like the more local customary forms of authority for land arrangements and so on. So both at national and local level, there's ways to boost youth empowerment and participation with the knowledge of the more broadly governance frameworks and the governance work, but bringing that into the realm of youth employment and rural youth. So that's where we finished the panel discussion. There's still time to answer some question. And there's been one around productivity that asked us to be more specific. I wanted to ask this to Jim specifically. So which agriculture should be boosted, which productivity, and because obviously every country is different. And if we need to, the point of departure is that young people do diverse things, how do you then promote diversity in that portfolio? What's the entry point for programming? Jim, do you want to take that on?
Right. That's a long, complicated question. But let me just. So I think the key point has already been made in the question is about diversity. So there's lots of different agricultures, and that's really important to acknowledge. And those presumably the pathways and the productivity enhancement in those different agricultural systems is going to look different. And in some cases, it might be enhanced land productivity. In other cases, it might be enhanced labor productivity. And they will look very different, and they'll have different kinds of implications for young people who are trying to start out, young people who are already involved, older people who are involved, and so on. So I don't think there's any single answer. And that's already, if we can win that point, that's already a very important step, that it's about what's going on in particular areas, in particular contexts, for particular people. And maybe if I can just tag on to that, and just to grab this question about labor intensification because it's come up a couple times. In a way, I think you could say that much of the agriculture that we see in rural Africa today, and much of the agriculture that young people are involved in, is already labor intensive. So to think that that the idea is to get it to be more labor intensive, when in fact all the young people are saying, yes, I want to be involved, or the young people who want to be involved in agriculture are predominantly saying, yes, I want to be involved, but I don't want to be hoeing. I don't want to be using a cutlass. I want to be involved in modern agriculture. I want to be mechanized and use technology and so on. So I think we have to be a little bit careful that a vision of a labor-intensive agriculture, which is all about creating employment, is not necessarily going to be in line with the vision that the young people have and how they imagine their own engagement with the rural economy, which is much more almost as business people who are managing agricultural enterprises, as opposed to seeing themselves as farmers as such.
Thanks, Jim. Justin, the question of labor intensification in smallholder production also came to you. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim made some good points. I think it depends what I guess what we mean by intensification. I think definitely. I think one thing that comes up very often, including in the Imagined Futures story and youth perceptions of agriculture, is I mean, nobody likes drudgery. Nobody likes to work, hard and intensively and arduously, of course. But I guess in terms of intensification, I think there is one way that agriculture can, or labor, I guess agriculture can be intensified. And I'm not sure what that means for labor, but for example, one of the articles that I cited is from McCullough, and she talks about productivity in sub-Saharan Africa in 4 countries, and she says that, and as Nicole rightly pointed out, the issue is not so much youth unemployment or even just unemployment, because I agree, focusing only on youth doesn't necessarily always make that much sense when these things affect rural populations generally. But one of the things she says is that it's the issue is much more about youth underemployment rather than youth employment, and she basically says that because so many people are involved in agriculture and are still in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, they are underemployed because of essentially, among other things, rain-fed agriculture, which can only employ them, even if it's labor intensive. It cannot be labor intensive necessarily for a whole year. So they might find other activities to do throughout the year to complement that. But in that article it's in the reference in my presentation, she finds that people employed in agriculture are employed only about 700 to 800 hours a year, whereas people who are employed outside of the agricultural sector, and I guess she's found a way to make that division quite clear, those who are not involved in agricultural employment, I think that's the way she says it, have about 2,000 to 2,100 hours of employment, so much fuller employment. So I guess if we can find a way, this is maybe one thing I would argue that comes from that is sort of derived from our paper, is that if we can make agriculture an activity that young people can be engaged in throughout the year, not the only one, but throughout the year, then that's, I guess, a way of intensifying either agriculture or labor, but over a whole year, not necessarily sweating more when they're doing it, because they are more interested, I think, in, let's say, more modern types of agriculture. And I'll just finish by saying that in terms of intensification and agroecological production, I think that's one of the other questions. And I think, as Jim said, it depends. It really depends on young people. And I think it depends, especially from Africans probably in who are attending this presentation. They probably would have a good idea of what would work where. We just wanted to say that productivity can probably be enhanced, but exactly what that looks like on the ground, whether it's agricultural, agroecological, whether it's more fertilizer intensive, or whether it's more land use, like in Zambia where there's more land, that will really depend on the local context.
Thank you. There were questions about climate change as well. and which I know you've talked about in the Include paper. So Thomas, would you be able to speak to the implications of climate change for the future of rural livelihoods and the potential of farming agroecological models?
Yeah, thank you very much, Majoka. What we find basically is not new, that climate change is obviously having a huge impact on agricultural productivity, particularly with livestock and crop production, and it's something not new.
Did you want to add more to that, or I think his connection just dropped again. Justin, do you want to complement what Thomas said?
Thanks. I realize I probably talked enough already, but I'll just say that in our report, I mean, there is a whole section on
yes.
Climate change and its potential impact on rural youth employment. So I'll just say that it's quite, I think it's quite detailed, and I think in fact there's even another Include paper that is on green jobs. So maybe I'll plug that one as well. That probably talks about, you know, the link to climate change, but we talk about it in our report. But yeah, I see Thomas is back. So I'll leave it there.
Thomas, one more shot at the question of climate change, and then we'll move back to Jim. There was a question about mixed methods. Thomas, one more chance to speak to climate change.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we have no sign of you, Thomas. What we also do is any questions we won't be able to handle within the time, we do reply written answers, and we send that along in the PDF with you, with all the other links. So that's another opportunity to deal with some of the questions. Jim, there was a question quite early on when you presented the book about the challenges of using both quantitative and qualitative methods, how they speak to each other.
Yeah.
You want to take that one?
Yes, I'll give a brief response again to what could be a much longer discussion. So our program was designed to use the LSMS national representative household surveys that have been conducted in various waves in a number of African countries. And it's a treasure trove of information so our funder, IFAD, wanted to see what we could learn about young people's engagement in the rural economy by using those available data. So we didn't collect any we didn't do any quantitative surveys. We just used existing data. And of course, those surveys they're general household surveys about agriculture and rural life, I guess, in some ways. And they have some elements where they directly address young people, but in other places, the young people are just kind of hidden within more general household activities, and the specific youth activities are not transparent. You can't pull them out. So it's not satisfactory in the sense that you can learn some things, but you can't. The really interesting questions where you'd really like to get to more detail about young people's activities, what they're doing, who's involved. It's some of that stuff just isn't available. So that's one big problem. I mean, if we really want to learn to look in a more quantitative way at youth livelihoods, we probably are going to need surveys and quantitative data that's designed much more in a much more focused way to look at youth livelihoods and not to look at households. That's one thing. The second thing is about timing. So 4 years, it seems like a pretty long research period. It turns out, of course, that it's not. And when everything else happens, and we need to sequence, how are we going to integrate and learn and have lessons between the quantitative and the qualitative work, it all becomes very compressed. And that, to me, just not having enough time to think together, to reflect, to do the back and forth between what's going on with the qualitative on the qualitative side and what's going on in the quantitative, that's a really big challenge. And in any kind of short-term research program, I mean, some people will say 4 years, that's a long time. I mean, I only had 6 months, or I only had 2 months, but in fact, there's a real challenge there, and it's something to do with the nature of the kinds of research that is being commissioned these days. And of course, it's no mean, it's not a small undertaking to commission and do new quantitative research. And I'm not suggesting we want to necessarily do that, but the existing data sets, the LSMS type data sets, only go so far. And unfortunately, in a lot of key areas, it's not quite far enough.
Thanks very much. I'm looking at the time and I'm looking at the sheet of all questions. I think so far I think we've covered pretty much all of them, although not all of them in as much detail as we would have wanted. So for example, the question of which sector to promote or which combination of livelihood activities to promote, that's, as Justin has mentioned a couple of times in his presentation, that's so context dependent. There's some detail in his report and his report with Thomas on the differences between low-income and middle-income countries, for example. There are other reports that do this. And in the book, the data from the more quantitative part of the research also speaks more to this diversity. So I hope you will take the opportunity and take the time to look more at all these publications. They're all open access online. You will receive all the links to these publications in the following week. I think we're getting to the end of our time for the webinar. Just want to have one more look at all panelists to see if anyone has any final thoughts to leave us with.
Nope.
Yeah, you can do a quick wave. In that case, I want to thank everyone for attending, for making the time on a Friday while everybody is probably quite zoomed out already after more than a year of pandemic. So thanks so much for making the time and joining us. We do definitely hope to continue the conversation with anyone who's interested. So please get in touch for any follow-up or more interest in other publications. The next webinar is on the 22nd of June, which will be on young people in humanitarian settings. And that webinar will focus again on both the Middle East and Africa, with again a nice list of speakers. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, speakers, and I hope to see you again in the next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.